There's not a single day that passes without you on my mind.
It's okay for everyone. I would like to begin by thanking my comrades here in Podemos Zürich for organizing this event. I arrived 5 minutes before the beginning of the event, but I hope very much that we will have time later to discuss and to talk about everything that's going on here and in Spain. I would also like to begin by stating how, one impression, one feeling that one has is that how different our context is from this trajectory that you just exposed. Our movement, our project, our hypothesis, everything we are doing cannot be understood without taking into consideration the conditions, the material conditions through which the Spanish people has been going through in the last 6 to 7 years. It is almost a meaningless exercise to repeat once and again the numbers of unemployment, the increasing inequality, the debt, the number of people who have left the country. It's a landscape in which the very conditions of citizenship have been systematically and intentionally demolished. So one cannot understand what Podemos is, whatever it is, all this very complex mathematic movement that has been shaking the political landscape in the better part of the last year, without understanding that popular reaction, that movement of political organization that at the end is doing something very basic, is fighting for civil liberties and social rights that were deemed to be almost essential to the condition of citizenship just a few years ago. Things that we took for granted, things that one could not imagine oneself without, have been not only put into question but basically taken from people. So without that context of social aggression, of a second transition, so to speak, in the Spanish political system, a transition towards a neoliberal model where social rights are basically dismantled. Without that context, it's very, very difficult even to ask oneself this question, the question of this event, from the streets to the institutions, all the contradictions, the challenges, the problems that such a movement poses. So what I wanted to do is to take very literally the issue that you have chosen, from the streets to the institutions. And of course, already in the introduction, the reference is very clear to the movement of the Indignados, as it is known outside of Spain, the 15M as it is known in Spain, which was this event very, very difficult to describe, very difficult to understand, very difficult to analyze even today, because its interpretation is what is part of its strength. The fact that it remains open, the fact that it can nourish very different narratives. If the 15M was something, I believe was a symptom and a diagnosis, a symptom of a collapsing system, not only political and economical, but symbolic, a system of interpretation, a system for allocating meanings to the basic categories through which we understand our social life. What the 15M made visible from the beginning for everybody to see was that there was a system that was in crisis, a system that could not reproduce itself anymore. There was this very distinct, very powerful political intuition coming from below, from the streets, pointing in a somewhat confused manner, but at the same time very clearly, to a logic of governance where there is an indistinction between political and economic powers, between the political and economic elites, and that there was a very clear attribution of responsibility towards those elites for what was not yet the economic crisis. The 15M came, so to speak, before its time, if one has a mechanic understanding of things. The crisis was not so bad, the effects were not so bad at the beginning of 2011 as they were later on. It anticipated what was going to happen and pointed to the responsibility of those in control of this logic of governance that basically in Spain is understood as corruption, pure and simple. Corruption is not just an accumulation of cases, of individual cases, it's the very logic of the system. It did it, this movement, this popular movement did it with a very strong democratic element. Democratic understood at its purest level, in its purest form. Citizens gathering in public spaces with no preconditions, with no pre-assumptions, just to elaborate a social tissue through words, through practices, through the exchange and sharing of basically the exercise of their citizenship. It is very difficult as well to understand, and this is what sociologists have been doing in the last years, to understand what was the composition of this movement. It is true that there was a very strong element of the youth who were being already forced to leave the country because it was impossible to find decent jobs, and mostly of social sectors that had no political representation, impoverished middle classes, but also what I like to call symbolic orphans, people who had no way of recognizing elements of legitimacy in any of the political or economic, the unions are very important here, and so on, institutions, this kind of feeling of being a political orphan. And so they felt the urge of expressing with their bodies, with their actions, with their words, this kind of reivindication of being a full citizen. Of course, what is most interesting about the 15M, as I was doing before, is that it's not only what it does, but the possibility that it opens, the battle for interpretations that is there. And there is an element here that is crucial. If it was surprising to see tens of thousands of people in the squares manifesting this kind of rage and this kind of indignation towards the state of affairs, it was even more impressive to read the polls and see that 80%, up to 80% of the Spanish population agreed with the basic claims of the movement. So there were, so to speak, two 15Ms. There was a movement of people gathering in the streets and doing assemblies and organizing and so on, and then there was a much more diffused, abstract or ambiguous movement that reached even 80% of the population, and that includes a lot of very conservative sectors of the Spanish society that, however, felt, so to speak, a certain connection to what was going on. It is something that we have seen in the movement anti-evictions, for example, as well. Very strong support from the population to something, a political practice that is going on. So this battle for interpretation that is still open, what did it mean, where is it going, if it is still alive or not, had, so to speak, these two levels. Of course, one of the main criticisms that was addressed to the 15M was the fact that, well, it was beautiful but inefficient. It didn't have actual concrete results to show for its mobilization. But at the same time, almost immediately after, there were these other popular movements, which in Spain are called mareas or the waves, that organized using a lot of the tools that were created or rediscovered in the squares, and that constituted this so very powerful, very efficient, of course mobilizing less people, but with a high degree of efficiency, managed to articulate these popular social movements to defend, well, the right to housing, the right to the public health system, the right to the education system, and so on. Almost immediately after, and of course related to this question about the efficacy of these social movements, there was this big, very complex, manifold, plural debate about what was the best way to give an electoral or institutional articulation to all that energy and all that, let's say, new common sense that was created in the streets. And there were many different projects that tried to give an answer to that same question. How do we create an electoral or institutionally oriented machine to express all this, let's say, will and energy into a proper institutional form? This is a very hot question in a certain sense, because it generates very, very strong feelings about it, because at the 15M, at the core of its democratic element was a very, very strong critique of political representation and of the machinery of political representation as we knew it. So we always say in Podemos that when the 15M happened, the political establishment reacted by saying, that is not how you change things. If you want to change things, well, run for elections. And then what we say is, well, that's actually what we're doing now. We are here to do just that. But of course, there are many different views and interpretations of that project, of that process. How to articulate, how to organize it, and what kind of mechanisms to adopt, what kind of directions to follow. So I will try to explain here what I believe is the hypothesis or the logic that we followed, that very complex we, that is Podemos, made of very, very different bits and pieces from very different origins, traditions, ways of understanding politics, ethics, and the role in the institutions. All these very different elements came together under a certain hypothesis. I think that Podemos is born, first of all, out of the many failures in interpreting the 15M, in interpreting what was going on. Why do I say that? Because there was a standard reaction, so to speak, in the traditional left that saw the streets full of people and said, finally, there are thousands of people that finally woke up, they finally understood what we have always known, and they are joining our space, our political space. They are coming towards us. Finally, it was a matter of time. People understood what is going on, then they are coming. Actually, it didn't happen that way. It didn't happen that way. There was no translation of this rise of popular and social mobilization into the classical forms of representation of the what is broadly known as the left. And in fact, in those places where the left was, let's say, the left to the socialists, so to speak, where the left was stronger, where they had, systems of social articulations, political representation, union implantation, and so on. In the places where that was stronger, the 15M had less strength, so to speak. In the squares also, one could see that many people were very uncomfortable with the traditional language of the left, the flags, the symbols, so to speak. It wasn't that. They were trying to say something different and to say it in a different manner. So there was this kind of disconnection between the traditional vocabularies of the left, so to speak, and this kind of social energy that was boiling and that was actually a moving landscape in which everybody knew that something could happen. That was the feeling that everybody shared. Something can happen here. That's what makes a political event. So the hypothesis that is behind the formation and the articulation of Podemos, what has been called the populist hypothesis or the plebeian hypothesis, so to speak, is that what the 15M showed, what it made clear and evident, was that we were going through an organic crisis in Spain. An organic crisis. An organic crisis is a moment where the logic of governance that is not only made through institutional coercive elements, but also through narrative elements, through meanings, through narratives, through interpretations. Well, it had reached a point where it was very difficult to maintain the agreement of the population around some basic consensus in the Spanish state. One could see this very, very obviously in the distance from the political parties and the political classes, in the mistrust of elections, in the awareness of the fact that corruption was endemic, in the criticism towards institutions like the royal house and so on that have been at the core of the political system in Spain. And what we saw that was this basic consensus that had driven Spanish society from the transition, many of them were shaking. Many of them could not guarantee the acceptance of legitimacy of the established power, of the established regime, in many large sections of the population that before used to believe in that kind of institution. Of course, an organic crisis is very different from a state crisis. We know that in Spain, country of the Eurozone, of the European Union, of the NATO, and so on, it is very difficult to imagine a scenario in which we will see, like we saw in Argentina, for instance, a president leaving the palace in a helicopter. The institutions work, and even through the worst periods of the crisis, Spain maintained a level of, let's say, stability and social peace that for a foreigner, a foreign observer, is very difficult to understand. How is it possible that a country with 30% unemployment and 25% of poverty rate has the lowest rates of crimes, for instance, in the European Union, and they went down every year. So the Spanish state was very solid. That we saw. It was not going to collapse. But at the same time, what was collapsing was the legitimacy of the kind of power that was established in the minds of the people. And that's where you have a political space to be able to fight for the interpretation of what is going on. To fight for the meaning of the crisis, to fight for, let's say, the explanation of who is responsible for that crisis and what alternatives and possibilities are there. We identified that, what we call the common sense, which common sense doesn't mean that it is less evolved or less complex or less refined than others. It's simply that it's common, that is shared, so that is agreed upon, so that the basic agreements that hold together a society, they were open for dispute. For the first time in many, many years in Spain, we could fight a battle for the interpretation of what does politics mean, what the institutions have to do. What Podemos did from the beginning was to fight that battle, putting some signifiers, words in the arena, words that were unheard before, words that nobody could hear in television or in the political debate and so on. We started repeating them once and again, once and again, once and again. Words like sovereignty, words like casta, which was this kind of broad concept, this broad category to identify the political and economic elites ruling the country. Words that like inequality, people from at the bottom and people at the top of society. We threw all these signifiers, all these concepts, all these words, and they caught. People recognized that they were a better way of explaining what was going on than the usual empty words that occupied the political debate. We said as well that the only way to do that, and this is something that has been misinterpreted, misunderstood, and so on, that the only way to be able to fight that battle was if we managed to occupy the centrality of the political field. Many people understood that immediately as centrality means center, ideological center, means neither left nor right and so on. But the centrality is precisely this thing that I just described. The centrality is the ability, the capacity to establish what are the terms of the debate, to establish what is the order of priorities, to force other political actors and subjects to react to the terms that you want to set. And it is not, we see this very clearly in other European countries, like France, for instance. It is not the same thing to analyze, interpret, and react politically to the crisis if the priority in the public debate is the problem of immigration, or if the priority in the public debate is the problem of inequality. It's not the same thing. The centrality of the field means that you have that ability to set what are the terms, of the conversation. We, of course, occupying the centrality means, and this is one of the central elements as well, the most important elements to understand Podemos, means that the discourse that we have aims at a certain transversality. From the beginning, we said something that is very complex as well, it's difficult to understand, is that the main problem in Spain right now is not a problem of left versus right. And what does that mean? It means that, and I was thinking about this in your presentation towards the end, with a very long and difficult question that you were asked, is that, well, that concepts and categories, they do not live by themselves. Left and right, reform and revolution, and so on, they are not statues in stone, set in stone in there. They have effects, and they need to be proven by their effects. What ability do they have to change things, to transform things? They are tools. Concepts, tools, concept, words, ideas, symbols, they are tools. They are tools to produce certain effects, and they need to be measured by their effects. What we said was that in the current situation in Spain, in the way the ideological system works, the distinction between left and right has certain effects. And that if a popular movement that is trying to dispute the current state of affairs in power presents itself or is presented by others, and that's another form of power, ideological power, do you appear in the public sphere as an extreme left, the left of the left, that immediately puts you in a position within the political spectrum and the political field where you have less margin of action. Less margin of action. Transversality means that if you have the ability of setting the terms of the discussion and saying, listen, in a country where 50% of those under 30 have no jobs, in a country where hundreds of thousands of young people are leaving every year because they cannot have a life of their own in here, in a country where the basic condition of citizenship has been dismantled, the problem is not where do I put myself on the ideological scale. It is not a moral problem about, our ideas in relation to some tradition. It is a problem of how much social force are we able to mobilize in order to change the state of affairs. It is what possibilities, what margin do we have in order to put forward a real alternative to the system in place. And what we said was, if 80% of the population agrees with the basic claims of the 15M, if 80% of the population agrees that an eviction of a family without offering an alternative solution to them is something that goes against our common sense, well, we have a very solid ground to be able to put forward that alternative, to open a political space where then we will have lots of contradictions, possibilities, challenges, and so on. But we have a historical opportunity to do that. And of course, within that 80%, that was the problem of the left, believing that suddenly there were millions of people who, because of the crisis, have become leftist. It wasn't the case. In that 80%, there are many different ideological compositions, a lot of different people. But we can fight in order to create a consensus around basic issues that will open the possibility for social transformation. Córtame cuando pase. So, why do I say that the hypothesis is important? Because it is the form of organization, political organization that Podemos acquired. The way we organized our discourse, our structures, our organs, and so on, our activity, depends on that hypothesis. It's dependent on it. We understood that there is a very narrow temporality here, that things will not stay open for very long, and we are unfortunately seeing it already, that the system is strong, as I was saying, and it is recomposing itself. The window is getting smaller. A wave of self-organization building on the culture of the 15M with people, and this is something absolutely exceptional, the fact that we're here in Zurich, and this is Podemos, people getting together and organizing and so on, and this let's say pure horizontal element that is able to penetrate different spheres of society and is able to set the grounds of this ideological, practical, and political construction. But many people, many observers have interpreted our movement and our party through those two axes. Well, there is an element of representation with an electoral machine running for the institutions, and then there is a base of people mobilizing in their neighborhoods, in their cities, in their villages, even abroad, and so on. When I say that the form of organization that we adopted was very dependent on that reading, is that there is an element, there is a dimension that is missing there, which is that at the same time, we try to do something that, at least in Spain, wasn't seen, which was trying to open up participation. And participation means taking, political decisions and having so on, to almost anybody. That is something that comes directly from the 15M movement, and is that element of transversality, allowing people who think very differently, who have very different lifestyle, very different kind of lives, which might be very distant from traditional forms of mobilization, activism, and so on, allow them to have participation within the party. Participation that can be expressed through voting or through other means. That structure, that complex structure with a vertical, a horizontal, and this kind of transversal element, of course, within the narrow times that we have, it's been a year, and in a year, the process that we have followed is of an extreme complexity, have made it so that I like to say that Podemos is a monster, a monster in the sense that it's something that has no shape. It needs constantly to find its own shape. And there are many problems, of course, many contradictions, many frictions, many difficulties that need to be solved. Again, I would say that one of the most important elements in this process is that, which is a learning process as well and an evolving process, is that we have been forced to learn, in a certain sense, to abandon a form of narcissism, so to speak, which was prevalent in the left. What do I mean by that? I mean that the possibility of having a real impact in a way and in a dimension that until very recently we thought was unimaginable. That we would never be in a position in which something like the jump to the institutions would be possible, has forced us to abandon a certain kind of discourse that refers constantly to itself, that constantly observes itself. We have learned the hard way the kind of contradictions that come when you have to play in that terrain, the terrain of the institutions, the terrain of the media, the terrain of the elections, for instance. I will finish by saying that it is impossible to understand the opportunities and the possibilities that have been opened by this movement and that are still open to this movement, without understanding the challenges. That's what a contradiction does. And the tradition of the left, the tradition of historical materialism, has always understood that society moves and changes through contradictions, when the form and the content of society do not fit with one another. Well, we are living an exceptional moment, and we are being forced to traverse many of those contradictions. The challenges are huge, but there are still possibilities. We have seen that there is a strong reaction from the system. In the past few months, it has become evident. Very intelligent reactions, even, trying at the same time to, finish our image, end our image as, the new politics or the outsiders and so on. So we are being normalized. We have been there already for a while, and at the same time there are other new people. So that the element of the new is not something we can claim just for ourselves. And at the same time, they are constantly trying to rebuild the left-right distinction, right? So we are the new left, so to speak. All those movements try to make our potential space of influence smaller. We were very successful for a while in being at the center of this public, let's say, discussion about the interpretation of what was going on. And there are many different forces, in the media, in the political sphere, in the judiciary, etc., constantly pushing us to a corner. It will be a very, very long year for us, and with huge challenges. But it is a very important one. Why? Because, as I was saying, it is impossible to understand the form of what we are without understanding the moment. And it is a matter of time, in a certain sense. It is a matter of being able to mobilize the maximum amount of force in the shortest amount of time. Of course, I get at the end to the beginning, so to speak, of your speech, from where do you speak? The contradictions that we will hopefully have to face from the institutions will be huge, and there are matters that I would love to discuss with you about not just the way of getting in, but the way of getting out of the institutions, Exactly. The information demands participation, expression. It's always a matter of establishing channels of communication between the inside and the outside of the institutions. There is plenty of room to experiment, as you were saying before. That is related to tools, but that is related also to habits. I think we are in the process of forming habits as well. And if we manage to gain at least some spaces of experimentation in that sense, nothing is written, nothing is set in stone, as I was saying before. And I do believe that the kind of energy that is behind our movement has just begun to write its own history. The future is open wide ahead of us. So I'll stay here and then we can discuss about whatever you want. Thank you.
There's not a